Welcome to another podcast from the Spinoza Triad, where myself, John Gibbs, Dr. Richard Miller and Dan Rowland meet occasionally to discuss books of philosophy and philosophers or anything else that interests them and try to make sense of it in a modern context. This week, we discuss Wittgenstein's Tractatus. We've been reading Wittgenstein, and that's not a small thing to say, because it's really difficult. I think we can agree on that. And we've been reading the Tractatus, and it's not the Tractatus, is it? It's known as a Tractatus. It's the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, which just means like essays in logical philosophy or tracts in logical philosophy. And we could talk about why it's called that, and that what his pretensions were. This young man, what his pretensions were. So let's start with then. Since we've all jumped into the deep end of the Tractatus, who wants to kick off with their first impressions? Not first impressions, because none of this came to me as completely original, because I did know something about Wittgenstein, but only something. I'd never read the Tractatus. So who wants to kick off with a first impressions of the Tractatus?
For those that haven't read it, it's in 7 propositions. It's the premise of the book is trying to say what can be said and what can't be said. He was from logical positivists. They were kind of looking at absolute truth. It's kind of a mathematical background, isn't it? The logical positivists. Wittgenstein's coming through that way of thinking, through Bertrand Russell and a few others. And I mean, it starts off, I mean, the famous bit to start, the first proposition, the world is all that is the case.
The world is everything that is the case.
Yeah.
The thing is, before I come to you, Dan, the people that read the Tractatus first were in a very narrow field, weren't they? I mean, these are philosophers of analytical philosophy. They're Bertrand Russell and others. And when they read this, they are jaw-dropping. They think it's something very, very big that they're reading. And that's often been the way it's not widely read. I mean, outside of...
It's very wide. It's read within that specific group, but from what I can gather, if you read about him, is that he was largely misunderstood as well. I mean, I've got his moments of thoughts. It's a sort of collection of his diaries and stuff, and he was, and Ray Monk as well as another guy that wrote has written a lot and lectured a lot around his life. And Wittgenstein wasn't happy with the way in which it was being interpreted. He felt that I mean, the one takeaway from this is that the sort of conclusion of the Tractatus, which I suppose we can get to in a minute, where Wittgenstein was going with it wasn't how it was initially understood, was it? I mean, very briefly, the book tries to map out framework of language, of what can be said and what can't be said. And if we say that, the book starts with that the world is all that is the case, it ends famously with what we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence.
Yes.
So we've got 2 ends of it here, and it's really the conclusions that were taken away from that.
Thanks for that overview there, Rich. It's a tough one. I think it was accepted at the time, and still is, because it was quite kind of groundbreaking. Russell kind of got a bit depressed, I think, because it kind of answered his paradox, because where it comes from is that he came over to Manchester to study aeronautical engineering and was designing propellers and got into maths, became very interested because he was using mathematical rules to make propellers for jet engines. And he got very interested in maths. He didn't have any degree or anything, just got totally interested in maths. And then went to the guy who was obviously the top guy who was thinking about the theory of maths, which is Bertrand Russell, and got completely obsessed about how mathematical rules work. And I think Russell had this paradox, which I might be wrong here, but the paradox essentially is, what is it to talk of all propositions, to come up with a rule of all propositions, when that proposition is also part of those propositions? So you can't really say anything which is general about the logic of maths. So from that, I think what Wittgenstein is then interested in is, well, does the same logic apply to language? Or is language just endless poetry? No, language is informing us. Language describes. Language is used in science. Therefore, there has to be some kind of logic to it. And then he kind of says, well, I'm going to be drilling into that and find out what we actually mean when we say something is meaningful. Like you can say something is meaningful in maths. It's a very interesting question. What makes it meaningful? He applies the same thing to our everyday language.
Can I pick up on something?
And
there,
I think that's what the Tractatus is getting at. Yeah, go for it. Yeah, go on.
I think it's a good place to start there, Dan, which you've started with, is what the Tractatus is getting at and what his objective is.
Yeah.
Because there's a preface written by Wittgenstein. And in the preface, he says something like, I'm going to solve the problems of philosophy. You think, okay, this guy, how old is he? He's only young.
He's only about 20
He's
odd.
20 odd years old. And he says, I'm going to, in this following bit, I'm going to solve the problems of philosophy. And you think, well, you think, well, all the problems, what you all there,
He hadn't been in the trenches, though. He was fighting World War I at the time of writing it.
It's true. He had, and he was clear very well. We don't want to go too much into the biography of Wittgenstein, but clearly one of the things he did when he headed off to World War I was to insist in being in places of danger because he wanted to find out what it was like to be close to death. So this is a guy that is very intense,
to feel more alive,
and very determined,
very intense
in his pursuit of some kind of ultimate truth. And if you say in the preface to the Tractatus, I'm going to solve the problems of philosophy, then you're setting on in a tremendously ambitious direction. And then the opening line, the opening line, that the world is everything that is the case. It's a sort of explosion. It attempts to blow up all of metaphysical, as you describe it, Dan, as that poetic stuff.
No, but this is what the point is he deals with the stuff that we can talk about, but he says the really important stuff. That's why the book is so short. That's why the Tractatus is so short. The stuff that's left out that cannot be spoken about is more important.
Yes.
So he wants to tidy up all the tools that we have. It's like, I don't know, it's like a gardener or a workman trying to tidy up his tool shed.
Yes.
Once the tool shed is tidied up, could just finish. Once the tool shed is tidied up, the builder then goes and lives their life outside of the shed. But the tool shed remains silent.
That's quite a good analogy, for example.
Yeah, that's what Wittgenstein is just doing. That he's just tidying up the tool shed.
And I don't know if you've ever tidied up a tool shed, Dan, to use your metaphor, or tidied up in the garage somewhere. But when you do tidy up the tool shed, you tidy up the garage. You end up you throw lots away. You throw lots. So it's a massive throwing away exercise. That's why I say out the window goes foundationalism. There is an original origin of truth that we can build on. Out the window goes metaphysics.
Exactly.
Yeah, the world. Out the window goes Plato's forms.
Oh no, metaphysics doesn't go out. What he's kind of saying is, let's not treat it like a fact. So it sounds counterintuitive to say murder is wrong, is not a fact, but he's kind of saying that is an attitude, that's a moral perspective. So you can't come up with a moral fact. That is what he's trying to say. The only thing that we can say is, like you couldn't, I don't know, with the tool shed analogy, you couldn't say that what the tools can make is actually in the tool shed. Likewise, with moral philosophy, you can't come up with the conclusions with the tools that you have. That's what I'm trying to say badly. So he's not dismissing ethical or metaphysical language or conclusions like a cold scientist. He's just saying the tools that we have available are not sufficient to make them.
Yeah, I agree.
I think.
I agree with you there, Dan, because if he throws metaphysics out the window, he brings it back in this search for ultimate atomic facts.
Yeah, whereof I must remain silent.
Yes,
I must remain silent.
In a sense, it goes round in a circle by dumping romanticism and all geists and spirits and will that are driving history forward. He's dumping all that stuff. He says, clear away all that rubbish. But in the end, he comes back to something which sounds pretty metaphysical. The pursuit of the thing that can't be said. Well, that's in the end ending up where you started.
in all the time we've done these podcasts or these talks we have, I haven't ever spent as much time on something as I have on this, and I haven't ever felt myself as lost for words as I am on this one.
There's a confession.
I don't know. Like I did spend a lot of time on this, and we pressed record, and I feel a bit lost with it. Kind of had gone through it, trying to understand the propositions. I think it's really interesting. Is it worth talking here? I mean, I was just trying to think about if somebody hadn't ever read Tractatus or wasn't aware of him.
There's probably a few of them.
Well, I mean, I'm just wondering whether or not what it would make, how much what we're saying would make sense to anyone listening, because maybe we could talk a little bit about. So he starts off saying about language, and he wants to know what we can say about any topic, and he uses this picture form of language, doesn't he? And he starts to break it down into the way in which he looks at you have an object and you have a name for the object, and you have a set of elementary propositions which he thinks links to what he calls states of affairs, and then propositions and facts and language and words. So you've got, if you like, 4 areas of which he thinks language correlate or relate to the material world or an object itself. I think the one I found interesting here was that, we started off talking about there, the world is all there is.
The case.
We've got states of affairs here. States of affairs are the way in which objects link together, the way in which a combination of objects, I'm trying to think of an example of what would be there, that we're sat here now, and I've got a series of facts and objects. I've got a phone opposite me, I've got a pen in my hand, there's a piece of paper in front of me where I've got stuff scribbled down. This would be an example of a state of affairs.
Yeah, well, and the state of affairs, Rich, to interrupt there, the state of affairs you're describing, you in the room, the pen and the paper and so forth, only makes sense by putting them together in a combination of you in the room, the paper, the pen. If you said the state of affairs is the pen, it makes no sense. It has to be placed within a sentence that has a preposition, it has an object, it has a subject, and so the world is structured by relation.
Well, it would be an object.
It would just be an object. It's an object in the world. It's just stuff. The world is a load of stuff. But what gives the stuff meaning is the relationship with each other.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, because if you just said an object, that wouldn't have any truth to it. So if you just said apple, you're not saying anything.
Yeah, exactly.
But if you say the apple is on the tree, you're then bringing the truth of that object into place.
So if we have a conversation, Dan, and what do you think of Wittgenstein? I say hedgehog, bicycle, banana, onion, elephant. I'm talking nonsense because but they're all objects. There are elephants, there are bananas, there are those things. They're objects, and the world is full of stuff.
But they're without prepositions.
Their meaning comes in the sentence structure, the grammar of meaning, and that's so
exactly. Yeah. We don't talk in objects; we talk in prepositions. And so I think what Wittgenstein's trying to do is saying, well, how come these prepositions make sense to the point they're intelligible?
Yes.
And what he's interested in, I think, is the glue of the meaning of these sentences. Whereas some sentences, so what he's interested in is truth and false are almost equal because they're both propositions that can be verified or denied.
Yeah.
And anything that doesn't fit into verification or rejection is seen as nonsense. So you can say the cup is on the table, the cup is not on the table, could both be 2 true statements. Or you could say, the cup is on my head when it's not, is a false statement, but it's still a preposition which is meaningful. But if you say the cup is joyful, that's not meaningful and it's nonsense. Does that make sense?
Well, he has a distinction here, doesn't he, between sense, the senseless, and nonsensical. He makes those points here, and in the 6s, he goes there to talk about, after he's described the way language works and his propositions work, he goes back and talks about, the areas, ethics, aesthetics, and the religious. And I think really, I guess he was worried about the way in which the social sciences, psychology, philosophy, or philosophy, humanities were encroaching onto the things I think that he held dear to him, which were the religious. He was brought up a Catholic, wasn't he? But he was, I think, after the war, he was definitely he was going to be a monk at one point. He was religious in a sense, and he was also I think when his upbringing in Vienna had a very an emphasis on music and the aesthetic, so he was interested in the arts. And there was a bit in one of the diaries where he talks about how what music can teach you can't be put into words, which I thought was quite interesting, because he talks in the book about what can be shown and what can't be shown, and how he says about how music will teach you, but you can't put into words what it teaches you. I thought
like music, I think we can say logic is like music. Music has notation, can be written down, is in a book, but we wouldn't say we would understand music through its notation on the page. It has to be played. Likewise, with logic, I like your example, Richard, what you said, it had to be shown. With logic, you can't describe logic. You can't say, oh, logic is this. Like with any mathematical rule, going back to his original analysis, maths has to be done in order for it to be a thing. Likewise, logic has to be done as well, has to be shown. So you can't just describe logic, like you can't describe music. It has to be played. Logic has to be shown as well. So a lot of the stuff that he's talking about, I use that phrase like the glue. He's interested in the thing that makes meaning meaningful.
Even logic though in the 60s gets cancelled out to be. He then takes examples from logic, mathematics, science, and he uses them as sort of counter examples.
Sorry to interrupt. In the sixth one, he's kind of saying philosophy is not adding anything more to what's already there. Philosophy isn't adding any new truth. It should be just a means of clearing up, like the tool shed, my analogy earlier. It's like clearing things up so it's all clear and we know how to move forward. It's like a tool. And if you start thinking, oh, I'm going to dream up a new theory, you're not doing philosophy. You're doing some form of kind of ethical or religious language. It's not philosophy. So for him, philosophy is a very rather boring tool to make sure that what we're saying is meaningful. A bit like, using today's analogy, a bit like a coder tidying up a bit of code that's not working on your computer, basically. So it's very unexciting.
That's very interesting, that, isn't it? Because he after writing the Tractatus, having set out to solve the problems of philosophy, he thinks he's solved the problems of philosophy by kicking out the window all the rubbish, as Dan, as you point out. But in fact, he starts a whole branches of philosophy. The reason the Tractatus is so, you might think that it would be a book that would be, if he had actually achieved what he set out to achieve, which is to solve the problems of philosophy, and the conclusion of which was really philosophy can't do much. That I have proved, that you can't prove much. I've proved that you can't prove much. Well, then it would have sort of, in a sense, brought philosophy to an end, which he thought he did. He goes off to become a primary school teacher, and he goes off to design houses, and so forth. And then, because he thinks, well, there's nothing more to do, is it really? But oddly, you can see the origins of this pursuit of some kind of essential logical truth in the logical positivists, in what's known as alternative worlds theory. Foucault, you can see the origins of Foucault. Foucault's going to take this idea of finding reality through language, but he's going to focus on power. He's going to power relationships and class relationships, but it's the same pursuit. So that is why I think this book, oddly, is so foundational. Even I think when his pen came off the page on the final full stop, he thought probably that was the end of that. That was what we're going to do now. Close down.
Well, it's a book. The end of the book, if you were to follow it through to its conclusion, is basically saying that the book itself is
like a ladder.
The statements in the book itself are senseless.
Yeah, it's like chucking away the ladder, and you discover.
My propositions serve as elucidations in the following way. Anyone who understands me eventually recognizes them as nonsensical. When he has used them as steps to climb up beyond them, he must, so to speak, throw away the ladder after he has climbed up it. We must transcend these propositions, and then he will see the world all right. Look, number 7, what we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence. So he's kind of saying, once you've worked your way all the way through the book, and if you've made sense of it, to kick it away. Now, I did hear Stephen Mulhall, a brilliant philosopher, talking about, he was breaking down the kind of sixes and the kind of contradictions within there, about logic, mathematics, and science. I think logic was the one that he concentrated on. And he was talking about the framework of logic itself and how these statements cancel themselves out to be senseless. In a nutshell, he sets out to prove what language can say. He then takes a picture form of language where he correlates words through to material things, and then he sort of then builds up what you can say, what you can't say. There's obviously the statements there of scientific that can be, if you like, falsified or true statements within that. And then there's a load of things that you can't say with that. And they are the things that you can't say. And really my takeaway from it, my understanding of it with Wittgenstein, the important parts are the parts that you can't say, which can be shown, not said. But again, that is a real kind of a very cheap way of summarizing the book, because I think it actually says a hell of a lot more than that. And like a lot of these philosophers, the value of it is in the difficulty of it, because not all things are supposed to be summarized in bullet points, are they? And I think this would be a classic example of that. I think it says a lot more. And it's really interesting. We've stayed away from his biography because there are so many great. I would point anyone to listen to the Ray Monk stuff that's online. He's excellent, because it makes sense when you look at his life, where he came from, and where he ended up. And definitely, I mean, hopefully next time around we'll talk about the later works, which I think are easier to make sense of. I don't feel. I think it's hard to do this book justice in what we've tried to do here, which is in a kind of discuss it in a general kind of over a cup of coffee sense. I think you either you either have to do the very cheap summary of it, like we've just outlined here, or you have to. Well, like, do you know what I mean, Dan? Or you have to go through. We have to go through each proposition and try and describe what it means. You would be, but it's not without value.
No. And the tough thing about it is that there are no examples, no real world examples.
He doesn't use them. He hardly uses them at all.
He doesn't use them.
No.
Which is tough, makes it tough. And also he disappears into, because he loves maths, he disappears into mathematical equations, which I don't.
He wasn't a philosopher, really. He was a philosopher, but he wasn't a trained philosopher. He didn't read. No. They reckon when he met Russell, he'd read Russell's work and Schopenhauer, and that was it. So he really hadn't.
He was a mathematician.
So in a very kind of positive sense, he was able to think originally about stuff, and in a negative sense, he doesn't really. It's not philosophy that you're used to reading, and also the criticisms of the book as well. But because he kind of critiques himself. He is in many respects philosophical royalty, isn't he? You don't see loads of work critiquing him. Well, I haven't. I think there are a number of reasons why you don't read a lot of stuff around. I think it's because it's such a difficult book. And there are easier. If you're a philosophy lecturer or there are easier people to try and give modules about, and then he himself critiques the first book with the second, with the one that posthumously related, the language games, philosophical investigations. But
I was going to say that in a sense, the biggest critic of Wittgenstein is himself.
Yeah.
In the sense that, as you say, he ends up at the end of the Tractatus saying, "Well, I pull a ladder away now. What can be said is the really important stuff is I haven't dealt with. All I've done is show you what you can't understand. What the limits of language are. But the thing is, showing you what the limits of language are is the birth of analytical philosophy. It's trying and the routes he goes down to try and show you what the limits of language are lead to all sorts of other avenues of the importance of language and truth. Because if we do live in a post-truth sort of world, they think what's happening here at the same time as Wittgenstein. So it's come out of he's written during the First World War, it comes out of the First World War. You've got The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. You've got before this, but hey, okay. But around about the same time, you've got Einstein and the sense in which the world is a logical place. And the other thing Fraser uses a lot is logical space. So, if the world is everything that is the case, then it's a logical space. It can be understood through the relationships of things and the relationships of words and relationships of pictures and chains of things. So in essence, he's the context of his time, Einstein and and also what are the artists doing? They're painting Cubism and Picasso's painting at the same time. They're trying to look at the essence of form. Break a picture down into its essences, into its planes of meaning. Modernism in art. So he's a deeply modernist philosopher,
not postmodernist.
In that sense, well, modernism is going to lead to postmodernism. Everything since Wittgenstein, in a way, you can trace his musings, and he's a child. He's like a child. What is philosophy? It's being in adulthood and asking the questions of childhood. Because he's not a trained philosopher, he asks the questions of childhood. What can you actually know? And he concludes you can't know much. But on the other hand, the things you really need to know are probably the things you can't say.
And that's what divided him, wasn't it? With the kind of existing schools of philosophy that he was involved with in Cambridge. He didn't. I think he didn't. It's the outcome of that, the conclusion. I think the key part with him, isn't it? Is that he thought the most important things you couldn't say, and you never really could. You could never know them in the way in which logical positivism or the more mathematical approach would say that things that you couldn't say weren't really worth saying. That would be the fork, if you like. There, I think it's worth saying as well. That at points as well, he was quite interested in Freud before he came over. In Vienna, he'd read Freud. Is another person that he was interested in, and I think at certain points he called himself a Freudian, which was kind of looked down on at the time from the philosophical, the philosophers of the time looked down on it. But I think it also adds a little bit of weight. Perhaps I didn't know whether or not Freud's emphasis on an unconscious and things that you can't know. Perhaps there's kind of a parallel there with what Wittgenstein was saying as well, as a kind of, it's almost like an unconscious, isn't it? That which you cannot say, you should remain silent. You can't really know it in the same way that perhaps in Freud there's a kind of unconscious. I mean, it runs back in a lot of philosophy, doesn't it? You've got philosophers have always tangled with this idea of knowing the unknowable, or the realm that you can't, Kant's numinal world, that kind of idea there, isn't it?
Yeah.
This kind of split, or even Plato.
Yeah. Well, I think you're absolutely, Richard, you're absolutely right. I mean, the pursuit of the unknown, or what the very first philosophers in the Western tradition, the people who are trying to say, well, what is the essence of things? What's the first cause of things? First cause of things is fire. The first cause of things is water. The first cause of things is just things interacting with things. In that pursuit of the essence of things, he's doing philosophy, even though he thinks philosophy isn't much. Because when he pursues the essence of things, he finds you can't really say much because he pursues it through language. But in essence, whether it's Aristotle's essences or Plato's forms, he's still trying to get underneath to come up with something that's true. And in the end, he says, look, if you follow my logical progression of searching for truth, you find you can't get anywhere.
Well, that's why he's saying that all philosophical conclusions are not based on anything that's based on any form of truth, because there's no logic to them. So if something's unknowable, it's going to remain unknowable. We can't suddenly lift up the lid and discover why it's unknowable. It's unknowable for a reason. I think that's what Wittgenstein's getting at, isn't he?
Yeah. Thought is language. Language is thought. And you can't think the unthinkable. Yeah.
When we're giving us an example of an unthinkable thing without
don't try and think
saying the wrong thing.
Yeah. And so if we...
Yeah, like a five-sided square. There's an unthinkable thing. I can say it, but if I said I want to draw a five-sided square, that's exactly what Wittgenstein's getting at. You can't. It's unknowable. It's because it's meaningless.
Now, I think as well. I mean, Ray Monk talked about after the First World War. What was left of the world he knew before it was very much, it wasn't there anymore. He wore his army uniform for a period after the war.
Oh,
and I wanted just to try and capture something. I mean, he had brothers. He was was it three of his brothers commit suicide. He was battling with. Personally, I think quite a lot of stuff which are reflected in these ideas, and how I think he obviously had a great love of the arts, I think aesthetics, ethics, and the religious. He just wanted to be left alone, if you like, because I think he valued them so much. Whereas, and that's the dividing point, I think, with him with the existing philosophy of the time, and I kind of have kind of a sympathy for that. We kind of live in a world now where people are you feel you have to say something about everyone. You have to have an opinion on everything. And it was kind of the Viennese culture. Apparently, there was this idea of silence. Of it's okay not to say something about something. Whereas here you feel, there's a compulsion to talk about yourself,
That's a good point,
to have an opinion on politics, to have always have something. You need to be able to say something. Where I really think, I know it's not. I mean, it's not the only conclusion to take from the book, but I thought it's not without value to say that some things are beyond what I can say and what language can say, and should just be accepted.
That's a good point. Silence, the old cliche, is louder than the
especially
noise.
in terms of aesthetics, I think, and especially in terms of the religious. I mean, I think about that one a lot myself, around belief. And these kinds of areas, and very often it's not something that I think the problem with the religion perhaps very often is trying to put these things into words in an intelligible sense, which it's almost like concentrating on the menu rather than the food, and I think
becomes meaningless.
Well, and the same with aesthetics as well. In the realm of aesthetics, well, I don't know if Wittgenstein's trying to say that it's no point speaking the word. On the one hand, that if you take the picture analogy that he's using here, it doesn't. You can't engage with something because there aren't the language fails at the realm of picture. You have.
Well, he says you can say stuff about what's in front of you. He just says you can't really say much about stuff that is not part of that logical jigsaw puzzle. So you've got all the bit. Here's a bit like the tool shed. Another example, maybe an object is like a piece in a jigsaw puzzle, and the actual world is the puzzle all constructed together. Now you can have loads of different puzzles which might represent different situations in different times, but you can't have an extra piece. You can't have something outside of the puzzle box. And you may think there's something outside the puzzle, but you can't add it to the puzzle, which is kind of what he's saying about morality, about aesthetics, about God. These things are not part of the kit. So you can't talk about them, but it doesn't mean they're not there. It just means they're inexpressible.
And important. That's his point, isn't it?
And important,
They're very important.
But that's probably the point he's going to change his mind on most when we talk about the philosophical investigations. Because he'll talk about how language does in fact construct those things. And his second book, the one that's published after his death, which you went into the graveyard in Cambridge and saw old Wittgenstein there. In his grave, very humble grave. He saw his humble grave. But just next to him, there's a woman called Elizabeth Anscombe, who's also considered a 20th century major philosopher, and she was the one that was she was in his lectures at Cambridge, and then became a philosopher in her own right, and was deeply influenced by Wittgenstein. But she takes the second kind of the pursuit of language analytically to arrive at some kind of morality. So she takes it in that direction. Well, you wouldn't have thought that was where she'd go from the first book, but if you put the two together.
So that'll be our next talk.
The second book, I mean, in a sense, I thought your example, Dan, linked on quite well with the second book, actually, with meaning and language games. But we'll leave that for the next podcast. Well, I just think that there's so many. That second book was so influential. Insofar as where, especially like continental philosophy went afterwards, but I still felt that
Yeah, and the whole idea that he's the guy that changed his mind completely. He didn't change his mind completely.
No.
You can see the origins of philosophical
definitely.
investigations.
That's the point, isn't it?
Inside thing. 1917 Paris Art Exhibition. A guy called Duchamp submitted a urinal, called it the Fountain. It's happening the same time, and I think this is crucial to what's going on right here.
Guy of the Fields.
It's Duchamp's signed Mott or something, a Mott, and he says, and they don't like it. Well, it's one insult. They refuse to have it, but it becomes a famous moment in art because it's trying to express that art can't be expressed. Anything is art. Everything is art. And after that, in a sense,
interesting.
We've been having that argument ever since.
Interesting. So shall we meet again to do the second part of this interesting?
Hopefully I have more to say that makes sense in the second half. Like I said, I haven't put as much time into any of the texts we've talked about as this one, and I felt more of a what's the word? An inability to say anything of any value.
But that's a purely.
We've all been stumbling.
That observation that you're struggling to say anything of value is deeply in the spirit of Wittgenstein.
In the spirit of Wittgenstein. Yeah, I should have just remained silent. That's what we should do. Release it and just say nothing.
10 minutes of silence.
Yeah. In the spirit of the urinal, it's all art. Yeah.
You have been listening to the Spinoza Triad with John Gibbs, Richard Miller and Dan Rowland. Listen to us again on Spotify and all good platforms. Thank you.